aside from record harvests and record hunger, we also had record profits last year. I'm talking about the bumper profits from the last quarter of last year of ADM, Archer Daniels Midland. 20% increases in profits. Monsanto, 45% increase in profits. Cargill, 86% increase in their profits. General Foods, 61% increase in their profits. Mosaic Fertilizer, subsidiary of Cargill, 1,700% increase in profits in the last quarter of 2008. Well, we see a dichotomy here, don't we? So some people are suffering, and others are making money off of that suffering. Now, there was a lot of talk in the media when the food crisis hit. Suddenly, we got food price inflation here. All these prices went up, people couldn't afford the food. Even here, consumers were concerned at the rise in prices. And certainly around the world, developing countries which had become dependent on the global market for their grains were having a very hard time. We're having a very hard time accessing those grains and feeding their people. And so the mainstream media basically attributed the food crisis to what I call the proximate causes. And that's what we heard about, just the proximate causes. The first one was climate. Oh dear, climate change is upon us, and look what happens. We get these big droughts in Australia. The wheat harvest fails, and now we don't have enough food to go around. There's some truth to that. There's a terrible drought in Australia. We do have climate change affecting our weather systems and our food systems, but still, we had more than enough food. A lot of talk was about the rising meat consumption in the newly emerging economies of India, China, and Brazil. How dare those middle classes attempt to consume as much beef, grain-fed beef, as people in the United States? Supposedly, they were the ones causing the problem, sending the prices of grain going up because they wanted to eat too much grain-fed beef. I'll address that in a minute because it happened to be false. There was a 5% fall in cereal production in 2005-2006, but we still had more than enough food to go around. And like I'm saying, 2007 and into 2008, we had bumper harvests. The other proximate cause that there's some truth to was we had very low grain reserves. Our grain reserves were down to about 54 days worldwide.
Are you supposed to have something back on that screen? Well, there's nothing up there.
Yeah, I know. They're working on it. The other, of course, and we're going to have to ask, and we'll answer in a minute, what happened to our grain reserves. They didn't just disappear accidentally. They were legislated out of existence. The other, of course, which everybody knew about, was the rise in oil prices when it went up over $100 a barrel. And of course, that doubles transport costs. And since so much of the food which we eat travels at least 2,000 miles, 2,000 kilometers, 1,600 miles or so, it affected the price of food. Fertilizer costs went up 3 times, which is why Mosaic Fertilizer was able to make a profit of 1,700% in the last quarter of 2008. The other proximate cause, very much linked to more structural causes, was the spread of biofuels, which I call agrofuels, because these are industrial biofuels. I'm not talking about, kitchen grease and whatnot. I'm talking about plowing under large parts of the rainforests and growing sugarcane for agrofuels, for ethanol, for export. Talking about the Midwest moving from a food to a fuel economy and shunting all of our corn into ethanol production, which of course sent up the price of corn. And finally, especially after the ethanol boom began to nudge corn prices up, and investors began to pile into the ethanol market, then we get financial speculation. Then we get Wall Street and Chicago coming in full force and pumping up the price of food with speculation, with buying through futures, in order to make profits. I mean, this is the same financial money which developed the housing bubble and was looking around for something to invest in after the bubble burst. It's the same money which, prior to that, invested in the dot-com boom. And when that burst, had to invest in housing. So what we see is a series of bubbles, and in 2008, food became one of those bubbles for the financial sector. But these are still all the proximate causes. These are all the causes that we talk about if we don't know our history. And what we're not talking about are the root causes. And the root cause, the one single root cause, is that we have a vulnerable global food system in which over 90% of the cropland is devoted to 5 crops: cotton, maize, wheat, rice, and soy. And most of these crops are grown in the global north and exported around the world. We overproduce in this country, pumping our cropland full of water, full of fertilizer, full of pesticides, so that it produces more than the land actually has to give. And then the surplus of that overproduction, which we can't possibly consume here, we ship out around the world. But since there are farmers all over the world, the first thing we have to do is destroy their markets so that we can sell our grain to those countries. And I'll explain how that happened in just a minute. But what that means is that we have a food system which is highly vulnerable to both environmental shock and economic shock. Because it's dependent on such a small range of crops and controlled by a handful of monopolies that there's no way that the food system can possibly attain any level of stability. So it's highly vulnerable to shock. And the other root cause is what I call the industrial agri-foods complex. These are the giant oligopolies, the grain traders and the processors, the seed and genetic engineering companies, and the giant retail and distributing companies that control the food system. These are the ones who profit. These are the ones who hold back the grain, as Archer Daniels Midland did in Mexico, causing the tortilla crisis. And then when the price of grain goes up, then they begin to sell. These are the hoarders. These are the ones who also diversify their assets and pump the price of grain up through the financial markets. These are the ones who take most of the food dollar. You know, 50, 60 years ago, farmers used to get about 60% of the food dollar, up to 70% of the food dollar. Now they get 15, if they're lucky, 18% of the food dollar. And with that, they have to pay for the production costs. You know, where does it go? Farmers produce, and they don't know who eats their food. Consumers eat the food, and they don't know where it came from. Why? Because it's obscured by the agri-foods industrial complex, which takes the largest share of the food dollar. And it's a big dollar. $6 trillion a year. Food is a big business. So how did we get this industrial agri-food complex? Where did it come from? I mean, one can go historically back into the roots of colonialism and from Jefferson on, etc. But and based on slavery and the piracy of the early pirates, as Buckminster Fuller used to call them, went around the world stealing the seeds on the U.S. cavalry, which cleaned the American West of its indigenous people so the United States could expand. But let's start with the Green Revolution. Let's not go that far back. Let's start with the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution started in the 1960s and 70s. If you're not familiar with it, it was basically a campaign to export industrial agriculture from the industrial north, from the United States, into the global south, into what we then call the third world, and then later we call them the developing countries. And this was initially financed by the Ford and Rockefeller foundations. And one of the men that they hired, one of the researchers that they hired, was Norman Borlaug. And Norman Borlaug found that if we went around the world and stole seeds from farmers, and then made crosses, hybrids, of the best seeds, searching for the particular characteristics that you were looking for, that you could produce what we then were then called high-yielding varieties, HYVs. And they did yield a lot more, 20, 30, 40% more than the traditional seeds that they had been drawn from. But they only yield higher if you put on all of the fertilizer, all of the water, all of the pesticides, and use the machinery in order to make them yield more. If you don't do those things, they don't yield more. So what did this do? We set up 13 international agricultural research stations funded by countries of the global north through quotas in order to develop these seeds all around the world in what's called the Centers of Genetic Diversity, the Vavilov Centers of Genetic Diversity. So obviously they went to Mesoamerica, which is the home of corn. And they went to the Philippines, which is the home of rice. And when they first arrived in the Philippines in the 1960s, the Philippines farmers were planting nearly 2,000 varieties of rice. It's not unusual for one single small farmer to have 20 or 30 varieties growing on a small plot of land at the same time. I'll fast forward very quickly for you. If you can find 3 varieties of rice in the Philippines today, you'll be lucky. They're gone. They've been stolen. They sit in a huge seed bank in the Philippines, controlled by the International Institute for Rice Research. But the farmers don't have those seeds anymore. This happened all around the world. And the other thing that happened was, as these seeds were given out, first of all, to buy the seeds, you needed money. So you had to get credit. You could only get the credit if you had something for collateral, like land. So the Green Revolution immediately favored landed farmers. Those small farmers, the billion farmers of the world who didn't have land rights, didn't have immediate access to these seeds. Then you had to buy the fertilizers, the pesticides, and use the machinery. And then you got a big crop. So what happened in the first instance of the Green Revolution was that the smallholders around the world, who really fed the world up until that point, were pushed off their land by the larger farmers, who had financing, who had seeds, who had the backing of the governments, and who had all of the encouragement from the United States, of course. These farmers then migrated, on one hand, to the hillsides, the fragile hillsides of the tropics, to the forested frontiers of the rainforests. They chopped down trees looking for nutrients so they could grow their basic grains. And they migrated to the cities, where they formed a huge reserve army of labor for the factories, for manufacturing, for industry. But that's also where we got the city's slums. If you read a very interesting book by Mike Davis called Planet of Slums, he tracks this. Basically, we are now a planet of slums. Most of the world's urban population lives in slums. And this is when it first began to happen, with the Green Revolution. But as a result, there was a tremendous amount of production of food. Because on one hand, you have the farmers on the hillsides, and farmers accessing the nutrients from the rainforest. So you have extra production there because you've increased the land base. And on the other hand, you have this intensified production in the lowland, in the bottomlands, where larger farmers are using these high-yielding varieties with all of the benefits of the inputs and the investment and the credit. The second, and during that period, what happened was that farmers around the world became dependent on the inputs coming out of the global north, the fertilizers, the seeds, pesticides, machinery. So it really was colonization of the global south by agro-industry from the global north. Tremendously successful in that regard, and also we got a flush of production, which then brought the price of food down. And there was a trend in these low food prices for 30 years. The next step in the rise of the industrial agri-foods complex were these structural adjustment policies of the 1980s and the 1990s. Now, these are the policies imposed by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund on countries in the global south who are defaulting on their debts. I'm not going to get into the causes of the debt crisis, but it's safe to say that we had a debt crisis in this country as well, just like the one in the global south. And that debt crisis in the 70s was with our farm sector. And we lost half of our farmers in this country during the debt crisis. And that's when we had Earl Butz, Secretary of Agriculture, say, get big or get out. So everybody tried to get big, and they pushed off half of the farmers out. And they all defaulted on their debts, and they were all given, the larger farmers, and they were all given extensions. They were all bailed out. Some of us here helped to bail them out, those who were paying taxes at the time. In the global south, they weren't so lucky. Because as the prices for their products, which they had been overproducing, sank, the banks in the north decided to call back their loans. And the global south couldn't pay. And that's when you get the third world debt crisis. So the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank step in to save the day. And they extend loans to the governments of the global south on some very interesting conditions. First condition, these countries had to remove all of their tariff barriers. Second condition, they had to sell off all of their state-owned enterprises. Third condition, they had to dismantle their marketing boards. Fourth condition, they had to dismantle their grain reserves. Fifth condition, they had to move into export crops, luxury export crops. So in other words, they had to dismantle their food system in order to allow for the colonization of that food system by the companies of the global north. Those were the conditions if they wanted money in order to pay off the debts which they had incurred during what were called the development decades of the 60s and 70s. And the third step in establishing the dominance of the industrial agri-food complex over our food systems in the world is the free trade mania which took hold from the 1980s right on into the present. We're still in it. In which the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, is turned into the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And we get the free trade agreements like NAFTA and CAFTA. And what these agreements do, essentially, is to cement into law, by cementing into international treaty, the structural adjustment programs applied by the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise. The G8 countries run the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The G8 countries run the WTO. The United States runs NAFTA. It's important to realize that these institutions, particularly let's take the World Bank, their mission is to end poverty worldwide. That's a great mission. I'm on board with that mission. But what they don't talk about is their job. Their job is to resolve the crises of capital in favor of the G8. The directors of the World Bank sit around twice a week and play poker. You take this project, you give me that project. You can have that market, but I'll take this market. No, I'll up you that market over there. They're using the economies of the third world, and they're using development, they're using tax dollars. By the way, the 10,000 people who work for the World Bank don't pay any taxes. They're using that to advance the interests of the G8. And what are the interests of the G8? Well, I think it's pretty clear. In the case of food, the interests of the G8 are the interests of the industrial agri-foods complex. And so now we have treaties, international treaties, that oblige states in the global south to permit the dumping of subsidized products from the global north into their local markets. So farmers, let me take that back, not farmers, because farmers don't export grain. Archer Daniel Midlands, Cargill, Dreyfus, Bunge, these giant companies, they export grain. So these companies are able to dump grain into the global south and sell it at under the cost of production. And that puts all the farmers in the global south out of business and makes them dependent on the grain produced in the United States. Now, it's not like farmers here get a good deal out of it. Most farmers one talks to don't really want these subsidies at all. They'd rather just get a fair price for their grain. Just pay me a fair price. They don't get a fair price. Why don't they get a fair price? Because if they were to get a fair price, if the government, for example, was to go back to the policies of the 1930s and 40s and say, no, this is the price for grain. This is what's going to cover the cost of production and cover the environmental and social externalities, then ADM, Cargill, Bunge, Dreyfus would have to pay 3 or 4 or 5 times more for their grain. So they don't want that. So we have to make it up by paying for the subsidies. And they get the grain on the cheap, and they go down and destroy the markets in the global south and create dependency on the global market for these countries' food security. So what are the results? Building up 50 years of building this industrial agri-foods complex. Maybe you don't know that in the 1970s, the global south was not only self-sufficient in food, because we're taught that they're always hungry and they need us. In fact, they were self-sufficient in food in the 1970s before all this happened. In fact, they even used to export a surplus of $1 billion a year. Not a tremendous amount by global standards, but nothing to be ashamed of. Now they import $11 billion a year in food. Industrial agriculture, which was really a rather small sector of agriculture 50 years ago, which had its niche here in the United States and in parts of Europe, now is dominant and produces 20% of the world's greenhouse gases because it's so inefficient, it's so dirty. It also uses up 80% of the world's available water. And it's contributed to the loss of 75% of the crop diversity in the world. In other words, we've lost 75% of our crop diversity thanks to the monopolization of these seeds, thanks to the concentration of the control of seeds in a few companies. This is extremely dangerous. This is the type of loss of diversity which created things like the potato famine in Ireland. We need diversity in order to deal with all of the unpredictability that nature throws at us, and now, with climate change, is going to be that much worse. After 20 years of trade liberalization, sub-Saharan Africa has probably lost about $300 billion, something close to $300 billion, because they're on the wrong end of the global trading stick. They lost that much revenue as a result of global trading. This has been calculated by Oxfam. That's about what we pay to go to sub-Saharan Africa in foreign aid. So, wouldn't it have been better just to let them produce their own food? Here in the United States, something like 1.3 million Mexican campesinos and campesinas, smallholders, farmers, went bankrupt as a result of NAFTA. And we got millions of immigrants coming into the United States. The other day I was talking to a farmer in California, and he was lamenting the fact that he was getting old. And he said, there's no farmers to take over the land anymore. My kids don't want to work anymore. What are we going to do? There's no more farmers. And I felt sorry for him. I felt sorry that the kids didn't want to take over the land. I knew why. They couldn't make a good living at it. But he didn't look around him. If he'd looked at his workers, they were Mexican farmers before they came to be his workers. If he looked at the restaurant chefs, they were all Mexican farmers before they came up here to work for a lousy wage. There are farmers all over this country. Just got to open your eyes and find them. They're there. And there are millions of young people who would love to get into farming. They're all there. I should say that the Green Revolution, aside from allowing the agribusiness to expand over the rest of the world, that it was very lucrative for the U.S. I mean, it was couched as, it was sold as a way of solving the problems of hunger around the world. We give them better seeds, they're going to raise more food, and we're going to solve hunger. In fact, Norman Borlaug got the Nobel Prize because they said he saved 1 billion people from starvation. In fact, in the U.S. corn and soy production, the seed companies benefited by about $10 billion a year by stealing the seeds from the Global South, patenting them as hybrids, and then selling them back to the rest of the world. The farmers who for 6 millennia have developed those seeds never saw a penny. And then of course we have the rise of the giant monopolies, the oligopolies, ADM, Cargill, and Bunge that now control 80% of the world's grain. Monsanto that controls 1/5 of the world's seeds. And who laugh at antitrust laws. Fining them $100 million is just the cost of doing business. What this all boils down to is what I call the corporate food regime. This concept was advanced by a researcher named Harriet Friedman from the University of Toronto, who helped to start the Toronto Food Policy Council, something else I'm going to talk about. But she basically says that a food regime is a rule-governed structure of production and consumption of food on a world scale. And she looks at this historically to see that we've gone through a couple of different food regimes. And then Phil McMichael from Cornell University says that today what we have is the corporate food regime, which is based on fossil fuels, dominated by the global monopolies, and characterized, among other things, by the supermarket revolution, and what are called global animal protein chains and genetically modified seeds. And they're controlled by the industrial agri-foods complex. The regime is controlled by the industrial agri-foods complex, the big monopolies, with the help of the World Bank, the IMF, the USDA, USAID, the World Food Program, and now big philanthropy. These are the institutions of the food regime that make the rules that govern our food. Now, food regime, how does one manage a food regime like this? And to understand it, I think we have to recognize first, this is a capitalist food regime. So then we have to look at what are the different phases that capitalism goes through. And Karl Polanyi, who was one of the great thinkers and students of capitalism, who studied capitalism and how it worked, who followed Karl Marx and others, and followed David Ricardo and followed Adam Smith, who were all trying to understand capitalism. Karl Polanyi said that, in fact, capitalism always goes through 2 different periods, if you look through history. It goes through what's called a liberalization period, which is characterized by unregulated markets and sort of breathtaking capital expansion, followed by devastating busts. And then it has to go through a reformist period, in which markets, supply, and consumption are all regulated in an effort to restabilize the regime. And it goes back and forth. Liberalization, reform, liberalization, reform. So, if you look at the 1929 crash and depression, that was following a period of liberalization. Then we get the crash. Then we get the New Deal, and we have a whole period of reform. And then Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan get into office, And we moved very quickly into another period of liberalization, which we call neoliberalization now. Right? And that's where we are. We're in a period of intense neoliberalization. And that's the same is true for the corporate food regime. The corporate food regime has gone through phases of liberalization and reform. And it's in a period of neoliberalization now. And I've already named all of their main institutions. Right? Their orientation is corporate. The discourse is food enterprise. And their approach to the food crisis is very telling. The food crisis hits. We know why it hits. And they say, we can solve it. The architects of the food crisis, in other words, like calling an arsonist to put out the fire. The arsonists come and say, we can put out the fire, and we're going to put it out with more liberalization, more free markets, fewer grain reserves, and more technology. Another green revolution. This one based on genetically modified organisms. And they have a guiding document. It's the World Bank's 2008 Development Report on Agriculture. The bank hadn't spoken a word about agriculture for over 20 years. They'd ignored agriculture. But that's their guiding report now. There's also a reformist current, if not a full-fledged trend, within the food regime. It's always there. It's just that at any given time, either the neoliberal trend will be dominant, or the reformist trend will be dominant, just like capitalism. The reformist trend, I have to say, is just as meek and weak in the food regime as it is in our government in general. You see, the difficulty of the Obama administration to keep from falling into Afghanistan, the difficulty of the Obama administration in attempting to extricate itself from Iraq, the difficulty that Obama has in passing the meekest of healthcare reform programs. And you realize that the reformists are not very strong within capitalism, and they're not very strong within the food regime. The reformists in the food regime talk about mainstreaming the good things that we like fair trade coffee, organic agriculture, finding ways so that the corporate agri-food system can incorporate some of these good things, reforming them a bit, not doing away with them, not putting something separate in their place, but trying to make them a little nicer. They also depend on the World Development Report for Agriculture. And their approach to the food crisis was basically the same, except they said, well, we need more safety nets and we need more food aid. Right? And we need a little bit more flexibility in letting countries protect their agriculture. But that was it. They weren't really interested in changing things. So I probably got you all depressed. It depresses me. It depresses the hell out of me. I have to study this stuff every day. And I have to write about it, and then sleep well at night so I can go at it again the next day. The good news is that in response to the corporate food regime, we have the rise of the food movements. And then we have the rise of food movements around the world. And you know what I'm talking about. The CSAs, the farmers' markets, the local food policy councils, the MST, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, the Via Campesina, which is the International Peasant Federation, right? Movements all over Europe trying to, let's call it breaking through the asphalt, trying to green urban areas with food, right? Community gardens, farm-to-school programs, the calls by the National Family Farm Coalition and Via Campesina to take agriculture out of the WTO, to reestablish grain reserves. Grain reserves are very important, not just to have food during difficult times, but the grain reserves regulate the price of grain. Because if the price of grain goes up, you let some grain out of the grain reserve into the market, bring the price down. If the price goes down too far, you buy up some of the grain, brings the price back up, store the grain in the reserve. It's a great way of maintaining a stable price, which is what farmers need, rather than subsidies. Calling for a floor price so that the cost of production, including The environmental externalities are reflected in the price of the product. These things are happening all over the world. Literally thousands and thousands of organizations working on these issues. And millions of people. Sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture. There was a study done not long ago by the University of Michigan which asked the question, can sustainable agriculture feed the world? And they looked at studies all over the world comparing sustainable to conventional agriculture, and what they came up with was several scenarios, low, medium, and high production scenarios. And every single one of those scenarios, the answer was yes. We don't need industrial agriculture to feed us. We can feed ourselves perfectly well with organic and more agroecological and sustainable approaches. In fact, we can feed a population of up to 10 billion people. It's not a problem of technology. It's a problem of distribution. It's a problem of control over the food system itself. I don't get to show you the pretty slides, I guess. Now, I want to talk to you as activists. I'm sure many of you are involved in this type of work. That's probably why you came to this talk. And I want to talk to you as people from the United States, or people who live in the United States, primarily. And I want us to take a closer look at our food movement. Because I think that we have two trends. Just as the corporate food regime has two trends, I think that the food movement has two trends. And I think one trend I would call the transitional trend. And these are the folks who care about sustainability and food justice, empowerment. These are the alternative fair trade and some slow food chapters, the community food security movement, a lot of the CSAs, the food policy councils, a lot of the youth food and justice organizations, some of the farm and labor organizations. And they're all about, let's have good, healthy, agroecologically produced food. Let's go local. Let's have more control over our food system. Let's turn food systems in the inner cities into engines for local economic growth. They're about the right to food, about better food safety, better safety nets. Then I'd say there's another trend, which is not as strong in our country, not as strong in the United States, but much stronger globally. And that's the transformational trend. And this is the trend within the food movements for food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is the concept, the political concept and the platform advanced by Via Campesina some 13 years ago. And basically, food sovereignty is people's right to healthy and culturally appropriate food, produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and the right to define their own food and agricultural systems. I think it's very important to know where this definition came from. This definition came from the peasants in the Peasant Federation, Via Campesina. There's about 1 billion peasants in the world. They produce over half of the world's food. If you expect to solve the food crisis in any way, you've got to deal with them. And what they're saying is, we want to be able to define our own food and agricultural systems. So essentially, food sovereignty is about the democratization of the food system in favor of the poor. The Catholic Church at one time in the 1970s took a preferential option for the poor. And I think this is something very similar to that, with liberation theology and whatnot. This is about taking a preferential option for the poor because, in fact, they are the majority. Over half of the people in the world are poor. And nearly half of them are hungry. And some 36 to 50 million of them are here in the United States, living in underserved communities, in the inner cities, and in the great food desert we call the Midwest, where people are dying of diabetes, heart disease, because of the lousy food they're forced to eat. And yet they produce our food. They're in the processing plants, they're in the fields, they're in restaurants, and they're dying. So, food sovereignty, this act of democratizing the food system, putting it back into citizens' hands in favor of the poor, is really a revolutionary concept. It's radical democracy. Radical democracy very much at the root of our own social, cultural, and metabolic processes. And I think that a food sovereignty regime is possible. We can rebuild smallholder and family agriculture. We can get agriculture out of the WTO. We can renegotiate the free trade agreements. We can put a moratorium on agri-fuels. We can rebuild our national food systems around the world. We can rebuild local food systems by re-regulating trade and finance, by supporting farmers' movements and consumers' movements and community food security movements, by supporting agroecological approaches to production, reestablishing our grain reserves, protecting local seeds, and allowing farmers to own their own seeds. I think there's a challenge, I think there's a danger within our food movements. Because I think that in the United States, most of us fall into the category of the transitional movements. We're dealing with the problems of food on a very immediate basis, in the neighborhood. How do we get good food into the neighborhood? With all these food deserts, which people can now call food apartheid. Because you can't find fresh food. All you find is convenience stores. You can't even find a Safeway in West Oakland, where we're from. So people are dealing with, how do we get grocery stores? How do we get community gardens? How do we do these things immediately? Farmers are dealing with the same things. How do I wean myself away from pesticides, fertilizers? How can I save my own seed? How can I get my own seed keep it from being contaminated by Monsanto seed and then getting sued by them for stealing their genetic material? These are very immediate problems within the transitional movement that people are dealing with. But we don't tend to deal with the structural issues that the transformational sector trend deals with. Land reform. How do we get farmers back on the land? Get them out of the restaurants and onto the land. How do we redistribute land? Get it away from the large plantations? How do we stop the land grabs of northern countries buying up land in the global south for agri-fuels? How do we get agriculture out of the WTO? How do we change the U.S. Farm Bill, which is really a farm and food bill? In fact, more money in the Farm Bill goes towards consumption issues instead of production issues. It's really a food bill. We should all be voting on it. We should all be pressuring our urban legislators to weigh in on the Farm Bill. These are the structural issues, the more transformational issues. These are the ones which take the corporate food regime on at its very rules and institutions. Whereas the transitional movement, where most of us work, I would say, is just dealing with getting by day to day and getting some fresh food into the community, healthy food. That transitional trend, I would submit to you, if it aligns itself with the reformist trend within the corporate food regime, it will only serve to reinforce the corporate food regime. If it aligns itself, on the other hand, with the transformational trends at home and abroad, then I think we have a chance of transforming the corporate food regime. And why do I say this? If you look back, the 1930s, after the crash, and you look at the New Deal, do you think the New Deal came about just because of Roosevelt's largesse? Because of his wisdom, his vision? I mean, he had all that. But that's not why it came about. I consider Obama to be a man of wisdom and vision, and yet he can't get the most minimal reforms out the door. It's because back in the 30s, there was a strong transformational movement, a strong labor movement, which scared capitalism half to death because they were afraid they were going to get pulled down by workers. And it was that strength, the strength in union power, community power, the Grange, I mean, that is what forced capitalism to reform. I don't think we can rely on the wisdom of the neoliberal or the liberal trends within capital to reform capitalism. They'll go right on making profits until they destroy the social and environmental basis of capitalism. But I don't think that the reformist sectors today are strong enough to do anything. So where is this going to come from? Who's going to lead the political change? Who's going to apply the pressure for that type of change? I don't think it comes from the reformist sectors. I think it comes from the transformational sectors. And I think that those of us who work in transition and work in our communities and whatnot have to be looking at and align with those forces of transformation if we really want to put the pressure on the food regime. Now, I think we have to realize that there are some systemic divergences in our food movement. This isn't our fault. This is a historical reflection of how things are. So you have, for example, a lot of people who work on food security, food banks, for example, food aid, whatnot. Good folks, good work. But they're not talking with the people who are working on structural change. And in fact, sometimes are direct odds with them. So, if the National Family Farm Coalition in the U.S. says, we don't want any more subsidies, what we want is a fair price because we're tired of overproducing. But you have the food banks saying, yeah, but we get the surplus from the government to put in our food banks. So don't stop overproducing. These are both good folks. These are both excellent organizations. But there's a divergence there, which has to be addressed and overcome if we're going to be strong. There's a divergence between the underserved and the overserved. I had breakfast this morning in a beautiful farmer's market over here. Fairly cheap. Good cup of coffee and a fruit crepe. I don't know, it came in under $10 or something. That's still too much for somebody, for the people standing out in front of Safeway, spare changing. That's still too much for families with single parents living in the inner city. Those are the underserved. If we're going to have healthy food, it has to be healthy food for everybody. The overserved who can afford to go to the slow food convivia or presidium and drop down $100, $150 for a meal and enjoy the pleasure of good, locally produced food. That's great. We should all enjoy the pleasure of good, healthy, locally produced food. But that means that the underserved, the workers in Walmart also have to have access to that good food. So we have to figure out how to bring together the underserved and the overserved. I also think we have to figure out how to bring together the advocates and the practitioners. I spent the night last night with the comrades here, and one of them works a farm. It was a collective, a farm collective. They have 5 acres, I think, and we ate some great fresh food from the farm. And that takes up all of her time, working on that farm. She's a practitioner. It's all organic. It's great stuff. We need them. But she's separated from the advocates in the National Family Farm Coalition who are walking the Capitol Hill, busting down the doors of the congressmen, demanding structural change for farmers. I worked with the farmers' movement for 20 years in Latin America. Fantastic farmers. They basically established sustainable agriculture in Mesoamerica, all by themselves. No help from the state, no help from professionals. They did it. They're completely organic. Their yields are 3 and 4 times what everybody else's is. When a big hurricane came through, Hurricane Mitch, back in '98, they withstood the hurricane no problem. Their fields are much more resilient to these type of climate hazards than all the conventional farmers. They're great practitioners, but they're not advocates. And they're being destroyed by NAFTA because they can't get a price for their corn. Via Campesina and Unorca and other organizations in Central America do the advocacy, but they've got to come together. And finally, I think that, I don't know how many of you work in the food movement or militate in the food movement. Brothers and sisters, there's a big, gaping hole in our food movement. And that's the labor question. So it's great to establish grocery stores in inner city neighborhoods. It's great to go organic. It's great to do all those things, but we're never going to change the food system until we work with the workers at Walmart, Safeway, the workers in the fields, the workers in all the packing plants across this country, in the Midwest. We won't have the political force to change anything unless we somehow reach out to labor and look at labor in the food system and the way it is now and what it could be. They're among the worst paid workers in the United States. They have some of the worst health problems, diet-related health problems in the United States. And until we form a strong alliance between the food movement, which tends to be now about putting in CSAs and grocery stores and this and that, but until we ally with the workers, I really don't think we can go up against the corporate food regime. The good news is that there's growing convergence in spite of the systemic divergence. Both nationally and internationally, we're beginning to see where all these different sectors within the food movement are beginning to converge. You see it in Via Campesina, you see it in the World Social Forums. We had one here in Atlanta. They're held all around the world. We had one in Atlanta. You see it in the International Links Committee for Food Sovereignty. You see it in the Community Food Security Coalition here in the United States. The human right to food has been championed by the UN Special Rapporteur on the right to food. And that call, the right to food, is being taken up all over the world and here in the United States. There's a new group called the Working Group on the Food Crisis, the U.S. Working Group on the Food Crisis, in which all these different sectors, workers, farmers, farm workers, community rights activists, food justice people, huge representation from youth, tremendous dynamism, are coming together and launch a food crisis campaign, ending food. And you know what it's about? It's about rebuilding our communities with the food system. Because when we all came together, those people came together, people were talking about, yes, it should be about sustainable agriculture, yes, it should be about the right to food. And the majority of the people there, who were poor folks, said, we need jobs. We need to make the food system into an engine for local economic growth. Otherwise, don't talk to me about going to a farmer's market. I got to get the food where I can get it. I don't think there's a contradiction there. I think we can demand that the food system work for us at the local level. We're forming food policy councils. And these food policy councils, sure, you can't affect the farm bill, but you can affect what your city does or what your county does. And you can create a policy environment which favors the localization of food, which favors getting good food into the schools and into underserved communities, and providing jobs and processing, production, and distribution in these communities. We see advocates and practitioners coming together in these food policy councils. And we do see the underserved and the overserved beginning to talk to each other. I just came back from Italy. I was invited by Slow Food. And I was, on one hand, very taken aback because everybody who came to the conference had to pay their own way. They each had to pay 2,000 euros. They drove up in Lamborghinis and BMWs. And I'm not kidding, a Rolls Royce. What am I going to say to these comrades, you know? And I said, thank you. for reaching out to poor farmers and helping poor farmers so they can produce good, healthy food. Now you need to do something else. Now you need to work with poor consumers. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to change this thing. And they said yes. There's a young man who runs Slow Food USA, Josh Bertel. He's a food justice advocate. There was an incident in Detroit some time back. Underserved community, African American community, they decided they didn't want any more fast food joints in their community because the food is killing them. But they didn't know how to stop it. They allied with a slow food group in Detroit. These are the people socially mobile. They know the people on the council. They know the politicians. They know the different business people. They have time. They can organize, and they formed an alliance. And they helped the folks in that community kick the fast food out. These are the types of alliances that are happening now. This is the growing convergence and diversity which we're beginning to see in the food movement. And I think that's the key. I think we have to look for convergence in our diversity and diversity in our convergence. And I think we can change this thing. Thank you.